Welcome, everybody, to tonight's presentation. My name is Pam Richard, and I, along with Lan, who happens to be in the red shirt, will serve as your co-hosts in this evening's discussion. We're founders of a nonprofit called Eco Justice Collaborative based out of East Central Illinois, and we advocate just solutions to today's most pressing challenges that weave together social justice, environmental justice, and the economy. And we are also part of the new working group of the Coalition to Stop CO2 Pipelines. So tonight, we're going to hear from three experts, and they will help us understand CO2 pipelines and the risks such pipelines bring to human health and safety, livestock facilities, and our environment. First, we're going to hear from Rick Kuprovitz. Sorry, that I was practicing your name all day. Rick Kuprovitz, a pipeline safety expert. He's going to be followed by Ted Schletter, who's going to help us understand the impacts of CO2 on human health. And then Durad Pettis, who was a first responder in the pipeline rupture in Satarsha, Mississippi, is going to wrap us up with his experiences. So we're going to answer as many questions as you have once we hear from our speakers. And we want to ask you to put your questions in the Q&A box, which you'll find typically on the bottom of your screen, more towards the right-hand side of that panel. But we also want to stress the importance of preparing for a potential pipeline rupture. And we want to make sure we identify tonight with you the kinds of things emergency responders and elected officials who are with us tonight should be thinking about. So it happens to be a full agenda. And we're sorry we got off to a few-minute late start, but let's begin now. So Rick, would you introduce our first guest?
Sure. I don't know if you can see me, but I can't see you at the moment. But anyhow, I'm down in North Carolina and having the usual kind of internet problems working out of a cheap hotel. So anyhow, I'd like to introduce Rick Kuprovitz, who's been a friend of mine for getting on for 3 years now. Has been working together on another project to stop the doubling of the Dakota Access Pipeline. Rick is one of the only, if not the only, pipeline engineer you can trust, because he's the one who doesn't work for the pipeline companies. All other pipeline engineers seem to work for pipeline companies and therefore cannot be trusted. But Rick has been a faithful friend of ours and a great expert, has just finished doing a lengthy paper for the Pipeline Trust on the dangers of CO2 pipelines. And so he's going to give us a very brief overview today of the regulatory environment of CO2 pipelines, or rather the lack thereof, and then some of the reasons why CO2 pipelines need to be deregulated, some of the risks that would be there, and why we need to have the kind of rules we normally have for pipelines to control them, and then tell you what could possibly go wrong. So over to you, Rick, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. You'll put up the slide. There you go.
Yeah, let me find slide.
All right, I'm president of Acufax Incorporated. I've been doing this business for over 20 plus years. I've got about 50 years, just sitting 50 years of experience in the energy industry. If you go to the next slide, it'll kind of tell you some of that.
Yeah, let me bring it up for the full slide here. There you go. All right.
Okay, and just hit the next slide. There you go. So I don't really sell myself because I don't need to advertise. I got more than enough business. Next slide, please. They asked me to talk about real quick, who regulates pipeline and pipeline safety. Congress gave PHMSA, the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, sole jurisdiction for interstate pipeline safety regulation many decades ago. Started out as the Office of Pipeline Safety. These regs are very minimum standards with a lot of wiggle room, as you'll see as you get more knowledgeable about pipelines, especially CO2 pipelines. There's a lot of vacuum in pipeline safety regulations at the federal level. And then when it comes to interstate pipelines, states can regulate intrastate pipelines if they meet certain requirements defined by PHMSA. The interstates can be more stringent, but not in conflict with PHMSA safety regulations. But the states don't regulate interstate pipelines like the CO2 pipelines being proposed. I need to point out to the public a big exception here in the Pipeline Safety Agency. A lot of people don't quite get, but it's very important. It's been there for many decades. PHMSA does not address liquid pipeline siting, all right? Congress gave liquid pipeline siting power to states if the states so elected. Many have not, all right? Others have. And some states handle pipeline safeties for their intrastate pipelines well, and others don't. I need to point out that you may seem very logical and very clear the difference between an interstate and an intrastate pipeline, but it isn't always that clear nor easy. Next slide, please. Real simply, CO2 pipelines can take three basic forms: gas, supercritical fluid, or liquid. PHMSA currently only regulates CO2 pipelines as a liquid under liquid pipeline safety regulations that move as supercritical fluids containing over 90% CO2. Okay. All other types of CO2 pipelines are not regulated by PHMSA right now. It's a big loophole. So pipeline operators saying we're going to put an interstate pipeline for CO2 across your state, you know, they have a lot of wiggle room. They could even avoid the minimum federal regulations currently established. PHMSA is working as a result of that paper published in March, has given an accelerated focus on developing CO2 pipeline safety regulations, but it's going to take a while, and it's probably going to focus on liquid. And I need to point out something a lot of people, especially in an industry, have kind of gotten themselves into trouble on. No pipeline is invincible to pipeline failure, especially rupture. Some of the newer pipelines, higher toughness steel, industries talk themselves into believing their pipelines cannot fail. And as the Sartasha failures clearly shown you, that's not true, especially with higher exotic standard like X80 that was in that particular incident. Next slide, please. Real quick, CO2 phase diagram. There's your three phases: supercritical, gas, and liquid. The key issue here that I want to convey to folks is on the line going vertical all the way down, it's about 88 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the line where if the temperature of the pipeline is greater than 88 degrees Fahrenheit, it's going to be in supercritical. It's never, no matter what the pressure, it's never going to go into a liquid phase or a gas phase. It stays as what we call a fluid phase. And that orange box kind of gives you the range of most of the pipelines. The 5,000 miles or so of pipelines that currently in the United States that are basically operating as supercritical CO2 pipelines. That's the range they run in based on the PHMSA databases. I think the key point I want to convey here is you go to supercritical fluid operation for CO2 pipelines with one main objective. You want to use that CO2 as supercritical for enhanced oil recovery, all right? So you got to ask yourself, you're trying to do carbon capture, and yet you're trying to design a system to get more money for your tax breaks that end up in recovering more oil. So there's kind of a disconnect here. Next slide, please. There's main differences in CO2 transmission pipelines over other hydrocarbon pipelines. Two major ones are CO2, when it ruptures, it can rupture in what we call forming a running ductile fracture. In other words, the pipeline unzips, and I'll show you a picture of that. The other major form of pipeline rupture, and rupture is the high rate releases that extend for quite some time, is the one like in Sartana, if I'm saying that correctly, please correct me, the girth weld failures that you'll see in a minute here. And yeah. The key point with CO2 transmission pipelines operating in supercritical or liquid is that they'll drop temperature very quickly, and you'll see extreme temperature drops. They get dry ice formation. And so, and the pictures will show that. The key with CO2 is once it's warmed up in the atmosphere, it's odorless and colorless, and it's heavier than air. So asphyxiation is a major risk. Now, the Sartantana, as you'll hear later, had another problem. They had very high levels of H2S. Very unusual, right? It will not be in an ethanol pipeline. CO2 produced from ethanol, it won't have H2S like that. But when you hear people commenting, we saw this green fog. That's usually, if you've handled H2S, you pick it up pretty quick. The CO2 release flows like water, displacing oxygen, settling in lower terrains and in buildings like in basements and whatever. And the rupture releases can extend for CO2 pipelines, unlike hydrocarbon pipelines where they have gas or liquid hydrocarbon pipelines that rupture. They can go many miles. Next slide, please. And here's an example of the CO2 pipeline on the top photo here to the left. That's a running ductile fracture that occurs in microseconds. It can extend not only hundreds of feet, but also miles. All right. And it does that explosively. And so when you're designing a CO2 pipeline to operate at certain parameters, you'll have to, you're supposed to deal with what we call frac arresters. That if you were to have a running ductile fracture, it stops at these arresters. And the picture at the bottom is an example of it's like a big band of steel. The pipe is trying to unzip, but then it hits this resistance and stops. That's just one example. The other, towards the right bottom, is another example of a frac arrestor. We call that in the business a valve, a mainline valve. It's the big chunk of steel that resists the running ductile fracture. Now, the picture on the right is the Sartatia girth weld rupture. And you can notice a couple things. Clearly, to people experienced in pipeline fracture mechanics, there's obviously a girth weld failure or heat affected zone failure, and it's going to release high rates of CO2, just like a running ductile fracture pipeline. Next slide, please. Picture from the PHMSA recently released report on Sartatia town site, or the Sartatia pipeline rupture. The map shows that the township of Sartatia was about a mile from the pipeline. Now, what you need to know is, as the first responders will tell you, is the actual CO2 cloud released went well beyond, further, so we say to the upper left corner, beyond the river. So my point is, CO2 ruptures can go many miles, all right? And you better know that. The red band on this diagram was what the pipeline operator had told PHMSA was their influence zone for a pipeline rupture, which was clearly not correct. All right. Next slide, please. So it's important to understand whether or not whatever is being proposed for your state is going to be under the current federal regulations. And there's ways to get away from that quite easily, even though they're very minimal standards. And it's going to be a while before new standards come out. And PHMSA knows them. PHMSA knows what to put in regulations. Getting it through the process and the lobbying efforts is a different animal. I think it's important for first responders and emergency responders to understand that CO2 releases are quite different. They require a different emergency response. It doesn't ignite or burn, but asphyxiation clouds can't be seen. It can be a real problem as you move away from the pipeline right away. The actual impact zone for a pipeline rupture regarding CO2 transmission pipelines will depend on certain critical parameters, such as pipe diameter, the actual phase they're going to operate at, and the mainline valve distance. I think it's important for everybody to understand If you're close to the pipeline right away, receptors, whether you be first responders, buildings, the public, whatever, sensitive people, can experience rapid blast overpressurization and extreme low temperatures that can be fatal. Now, that dissipates with distance considerably, but as we'll see in the film here, you'll get the idea of how quickly overpressure can occur. The overpressures, I think another thing, unlike other hydrocarbon pipeline ruptures, which tend to decay with time, overpressures from CO2 pipeline ruptures can also occur after the original rupture, but due to dry ice formation, blockage within a pipeline, that'll delay and change the rate of release. So you think, oh, it's starting to depressure, and so you start getting closer to the pipeline to try to get to people that may be impacted by this, and you're actually putting yourself in jeopardy. You want to be careful. I think it's important for first responders to establish communication with the pipeline control center. That wasn't the first responders' obligation, all right? It was supposed to be the control center pipeline operator's responsibility, and that was they failed to comply with federal regulations even at that time. Next slide, please. Let's go ahead and play the video, and this will show you. There'll be 2 or 3 issues here that I can point out. It takes a couple of minutes to play this.
All right.
So you saw the change, and the other thing is the big white cloud is the dry ice formation and a real drop in temperature. So the temperature drop can be fatal if you're caught too close to that. And so it's hard to tell first responders. You got to step back and wait to see what's happening. And that's why you need to be in contact with the control room. And I'm very critical of the control room operators who failed to link up with the first responders. And PHMSA said it in their report. That's a major problem. That you just don't do that. What is different about the Navigator proposal? I was asked to kind of comment about that. First of all, we don't know if Navigator is even going to be required to meet even the minimum federal level regulations right now. All right. Such as if they were to meet the minimum federal regulations, they're supposed to bring first responders into the loop. There are certain things they need to do with first responders. And so that's a good part of the PHMSA regulations. You got a regulation, but nobody's following it. That's not good either. So it's important that Navigator pipeline characteristics that are not being disclosed be made public. The various pipe diameter and phases can be very crucial. All right. And as you saw, an example of what an 8-inch diameter pipeline of a very limited length can do to release a lot of tonnage of CO2. Imagine like a 24-inch or a 12-inch that's running 10 or 20 miles. All right. It's important that Navigator publicize what the operating design temperature is going to be to the public. Not the maximum temperature, that's noise. The operating temperature, design temperature, tells us what phase they intend to operate at. They may decide to operate as a true liquid, which requires some chilling. Not much. It's got to get below 88 degrees, probably around 40 or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. But it would be a liquid operation rather than a supercritical. I think it's important that Navigator help people to understand, if they're asking for your right-of-way, that their operation is going to be extremely complex. It's going to be a lot more complex than the Sartosha 24-inch pipeline. And so, in fact, of the 5,000, slightly over 5,000 miles of pipeline, none of them that I know of are going to be as complex as what Navigator is proposing. Now, that in itself is not necessarily a problem, but it means if they were to have a rupture, they may know there's an indication of rupture, but they will not know where. It isn't a balloon bursting here, folks. It's harder than it looks. And then, as a point of reference, you all are familiar with what eminent domain can be problematic. If they go eminent domain, it gives them essentially a blank check to do whatever they want on the right of way. I think it's an important point for first responders, and again, I'm preaching to the person who knows more about this, that he was actually at the events. The first responder, because of things like 911 and the system that works across the country fairly well, are most likely to be the first persons to know where a possible pipeline release has occurred, which is why, when in doubt, you need to know what pipelines are in your area. And if it's a CO2 pipeline, get a hold of that control center. And they better work with you on that one. Next slide, please. Certain information should be made available to the public as well as first responders and emergency responders. In some states, all maps are required to be presented to first responders. There's not many states that require that. Texas is one of them. Washington State is another example because of some terrible tragedies. As I mentioned earlier, one thing that's really good about the pipeline safety regulations at the PHMSA level, the federal level, is they require that emergency protocols be established with first responders, right? They use the word maintain liaison. Well, having it in regulation and actually doing it are two different issues. It's important that the first responders and associated first aid folks understand that they can get themselves in a lot of trouble in a pipeline rupture. The temperature can kill. If you're too close, the blast forces that can change with time, because even with a rupture, the venting can run many hours depending on how the pipeline is operated in its diameter and all that. So it vents for quite a long time. Anyway, and for more detail, you can go to the Pipeline Safety Trust website and pull up that report. And I have confidence that PHMSA will get pipeline safety regulations promulgated, but it might take a long time. And my guess would be Navigator will be up and running before that happens. Anyway, that's all I had, and I appreciate your confidence and your patience with us this afternoon.
Well, thank you, Rick, for that. What I hope is an eye-opening presentation to all, despite the technical difficulties we had with showing the slides tonight. So now I would like to introduce, and by the way, do put your questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat if you can. We want to make sure we get to all of those, and I see there's one in the chat already, which we'll make sure we read later. So now I want to introduce Ted Schletter, our next expert. Ted currently serves as the science director for the Science and Environmental Health Network. He received his MD from Case Western Reserve University and a master's degree in public health from the Harvard School of Public Health. And Ted has co-authored books that focus on the impact of environmental toxicants on human health, and has published many, 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 many articles in the medical literature while also being quoted in the popular press. Ted works and maintains an intensive public speaking schedule, giving frequent talks on environmental health, ecological health, and I think this is really key, the precautionary principle. And you can see him in a multitude of webinars on CO2 pipelines that do in fact expose the risks to human health and safety. So with that, Ted, it's for you. You're next.
Thanks very much, Pam. Delighted to be here. Thanks for the opportunity. My task is to talk a little bit about the hazards and risks of carbon dioxide exposures. As we've just heard, at ambient temperatures and pressures, carbon dioxide is a gas that's colorless, odorless, non-flammable, and heavier than air. And it is classified as a hazardous substance by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, as well as the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. And the reason for that is because there are some occupations where workers are at risk for excessive exposures to carbon dioxide, particularly in confined spaces. So these two agencies have promulgated permissible or recommended airborne exposure limits that I've listed here on this slide. And what I want to point out specifically is that NIOSH has said that exposure should not exceed 3% over any 15-minute period. And I'll come back to that in a moment, but keep that 3% over 15 minutes in mind. Now, carbon dioxide is produced in our bodies internally as a product of normal cellular metabolism, and it plays a major role in regulating the blood and tissue pH, or acid-base balance. And it does that by the formula that's shown here on the slide, where carbon dioxide combines with water to form carbonic acid. So if excessive levels of CO2 develop in the blood or in tissues, they will begin to acidify, and that's called acidosis. In response to that, we have chemoreceptors in our major blood vessels in our neck, in our aorta, and at the base of our brain that keep close tabs on the CO2 levels and the pH, or the acid-base balance of our blood. And this largely determines our respiratory drive. In other words, when the acid level starts to get too high because the CO2 is starting to get elevated, we immediately begin to breathe more rapidly and deeply. And that causes us to exhale CO2 and return the CO2 levels to normal. This is all normal physiology. And maintaining blood acid base, or pH, within a normal range is essential for the normal functioning of virtually all organs and physiologic systems. Now, as we've heard, CO2 is heavier than air, and therefore it displaces oxygen. And Rick just showed us how that cloud that came out of a ruptured pipe would spread out, and as it spreads out, drops to the ground, will push air out, and in so doing acts as an asphyxiant. We just don't have enough oxygen to breathe. But independent of oxygen deprivation, CO2 also has toxic properties, most of which are probably due to this alteration in the acid-base body balance that I've mentioned, which is very important for all aspects of cellular metabolism. And what we see through experimental studies that have studied the toxicity as opposed to just the oxygen deprivation characteristics, that it disrupts lung, heart, and nervous system function, among others. Now, the susceptibility to the toxic impacts varies to some extent among people, probably dependent on age, health status, and probably other variables. Now, on this slide, what I'm showing is a gradually increasing CO2 concentration or exposure on the left-hand column. And then in the center, the health effects that are associated with exposure to that concentration, and then the timing of the onset of these symptoms or findings. And you see that at just 2% concentration in the air that we're breathing is enough to cause a stimulation of the respiratory center with increases in breathing. And that happens quite rapidly. And that's a response that I've just described that is an attempt of our respiratory center to keep the blood pH normal. When you get up to 4% in the air that we're breathing, it causes an increase in breathing rate, which becomes distressing. And now you're developing a respiratory acidosis that cannot be overcome by just more rapid breathing. And this is a level that NIOSH considers immediately dangerous to life and health. And the reason for that is because at 4%, it's not only the changes in breathing and the development of respiratory acidosis, but at this level, it can cause confusion, and can impair a person's ability to respond and get to safety. So you can see why NIOSH is saying we don't want people to be exposed to more than 3% for more than 15 minutes, because this is what happens at 4%. Now, if you get up to 5 to 10% exposure in the air that we're breathing, you see we get dim sight, sweating, tremor, increased heart rate, and blood pressure, and it can lead to unconsciousness within a few minutes. And at this level, we're seeing both a combination of the effects of oxygen deprivation as well as the toxicity of CO2. If the concentration is higher than 10%, it can cause convulsions, coma in less than a minute, and death within 10 minutes. And at 20 to 30% can cause loss of consciousness and death within 1 minute. Now, you just heard about CO2 pipeline leaks or ruptures, so I'm not going to go over this. Rick really covered it quite nicely, except to say that in addition to the dangers of asphyxiation and toxicity, as this CO2 cloud moves over the terrain and gathers at low points, it also can cause failure of internal combustion engines in cars, trucks, and rescue vehicles because of the oxygen deprivation. And so first responders will need an independent air supply if they come to the site of a CO2 pipeline rupture. And Rick also covered these variables that influence the spread of the cloud. So I won't repeat what he said, except to point out that as he also implied and said, that there are real implications here for the routing and setbacks as these pipelines are designed and sited, and decisions are made about the risks associated with the proximity to these pipelines that might rupture close to people, livestock, communities, and so on. And then finally, I'll just end by making a couple of comments about post-sequestration risks. This will depend a lot on site selection, local geology, and sequestration practices. So as the company is pumping the CO2 below ground, these factors will influence how it behaves below the surface. If the capstone over the top of the sequestration zone, for example, is not intact, you can get vertical leakage out of the sequestration zone. You can also get horizontal leakage. And if leakage occurs into a drinking water aquifer, which might sit on top of a sequestration zone, just like in our blood, when the carbon dioxide combines with water in the drinking water aquifer, it will cause the formation of carbonic acid, which will then facilitate leaching of hazardous materials like metals like arsenic and lead, for example, from the rock, as well as radionuclides, which could leach as a result of the exposure to the acid. And then finally, earthquakes can result from overpressurizing a sequestration zone, and this will be very dependent on the local geology. So with that, I'll stop, Pam, and pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Ted. Really appreciate what you had to offer tonight. I think Lan and you and Durward are going to have a nice conversation next.
Okay, I think we're set. Yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Durward Pettis. Durward is chief of the Tri-Community Volunteer Fire Department in Yazoo, Mississippi, Yazoo County. And you might ask why someone from Mississippi is on our webinar. The reason is because Durward is perhaps one of the handful of people who really know firsthand what a CO2 pipeline emergency means to a small community. On evening of February 22nd, 2020, a CO2 pipeline ruptured near the small town of Satartia, Mississippi. The first call came into the county's emergency management agency at about 7:15 p.m. and people reported a dense fog surrounding the area. Dizziness, difficulty breathing. Some people passed out in their homes. Cars and trucks failed to run because motors couldn't get oxygen. was later reported that heavy rains and saturated soil had caused a soil to move and stressed a 24-inch CO2 pipeline, causing it to rupture and release high pressure gas into the rural area. The CO2 spread over a mile, and by the time the night was over, nearly 300 people had been evacuated and 49 hospitalized. Durad was one of the first on the scene that night in Satartia, and we want to welcome him this evening as he shares his experience as a first responder to a CO2 pipeline explosion. So good evening, Durad, and thank you for joining us. I want to begin to ask you, where were you that night, and when did you get the call about the emergency in Satartia?
Well, I went out to eat that night with my family. We was in a little community called Floor. It was about 20 minutes away from where this happened at. What we have in our system, we all have the Misswind radios. We're on a Misswind system. I did not have my radio with me that night, but we are also on a FirstNet with the phone company. It pages us through our cell phones. We got the page, it come out over my phone. I was just fixing to start eating, and I played it back, heard what was going on, and just knowing the demographics of the area here, I knew that in that area there was a water tank for the town of Satartia, kind of on top of the hill. This, where the CO2 line ruptured, is right on the edge of the hill line, what they call the lowest bluffs, that goes out into the delta. Satartia is actually in the beginning of the delta area. I knew that in that area, it was that water tank. I knew the CO2 line was in that area, and I also knew that there was a natural gas line in that area. So what they reported to us was a green cloud and a woman was having a seizure. Well, green cloud, in my thinking, the first thing I thought of was chlorine, because CO2 is usually a white cloud. So I called the lady that's the town clerk in Satartia, and I told her, I said, look, I need to know who your water operator is. I said, we have a report of a green cloud and a woman has passed out. So the cloud had crossed Highway 3. I need to know if there is a chlorine tank at that facility. And she told me, she said, well, I'll call you back. Let me find out. So I immediately got on my phone and called our dispatch office, our 911 dispatch, told them whatever they did not to let anybody go into the area until we found out what it was, because if it was chlorine, they did not need to go in unless they had an air pack on. So just as soon as I got off the phone with them, the lady from Satartia called me. She said she got a hold of their water operator. They did not have a chlorine bottle at the tank. She said, but I can still hear the roaring. I said, okay, I know what it is. I said, you start calling everybody in Satartia. Tell them to leave Satartia now. Don't worry about taking belongings. Lock up, leave, go out on the levee at Dixie Farms. I said, do not come toward Highway 3. Because this line it runs parallel with Highway 3 in some places. So I got off the phone with her and I immediately called the field foreman for Denbury over at the oil field there that's in that area. This line supplies that field with CO2 for the carbon catch, for the oil capture. The oil CO2 flood in the oil field. So I called him. I told him, I said, I need you to call and find out, have y'all had a releasing pressure on your main line? So I got off the phone with him, and in the meantime, I was in the vehicle traveling to get on scene, and I was still telling everybody, do not go in. We might have a CO2 line rupture. Let's block traffic. I told them where we needed to stop traffic and block traffic where nobody could go in. I got on scene, and first thing I did was went to the natural gas pipeline. There's on the pipeline, and the thing that the first responders really need to pay attention to and know is on these pipelines, you're supposed to have a marker. It's supposed to be visible from marker to marker. You'll also have a mile marker on these lines. Every mile you should have, if it's a transmission line, you should have a mile marker on it. That way the natural gas companies fly their lines. That way they can try to catch problems if they see any kind of problem, or if they see anybody digging around the line that's not supposed to. So the pipeline markers, you really need to pay attention to them, because they will have the name of the operator on that marker, and they will have a contact number, and the sign is supposed to tell you what is being transported in that line. So I went ahead and called the folks that has the gas field there, and I called them. Their pressure and everything was good. They hadn't had any drop. About that time, the field superintendent there in the oil field called me. He said he had got a hold of their control center. The valves had been shut, automatic valves had been shut, that they think they do have a breach because they had a loss of pressure. And on this particular line, they have automatic shut-in valves about every 12 miles. This line is a supercritical line. Runs around 1480 PSI. And I tell you, at that much pressure and that size line, whenever it blows, even though you have a valve every 12 miles, if you shut them two valves in that 12-mile section,
We're losing Durrett.
Okay, the line is in the supercritical phase. The CO2 is. It's at 1,480 pounds of pressure in this line. It's a 24-inch line. And even though you have a valve every 12 miles to shut this line in, it's going to take 4 to 5 hours for this to bleed down. The reason being, the supercritical phase is, hold on just a second. When it gets to that supercritical phase, it's cold. It's real cold. It's not a liquid, and it's not a solid. It's not a gas. It's kind of in between all this. So everything has to evaporate. That's why it takes it so long to bleed off. We had people calling and asking, well, how come it's not bleeding off yet? How come they hadn't shut the valves? The valves were shut. It just has to evaporate.
Durrett, could you tell us a little bit about what you found in terms of when you got there, people? How did it affect the people that in Satartia?
Most of the people were having kind of difficulty breathing.
Okay.
Now we had several people that was trapped in vehicles that was closer to the rupture site. And they were in the worst shape. There's a lot of things that we found out about this, about the CO2. There was a creek that was running right in behind this, the pipeline, where the pipeline had ruptured. And it followed that creek. It was in a low spot, which CO2 likes to naturally come to the ground. Especially that night, it was in the 30s, and it was the ceiling level was low. So with it being low, it pushed the CO2 to the ground and made it hug the ground even more. Just followed that creek to the river. The Yazoo River runs through the Satoshi area.
So were people, did people have difficulty breathing? Whether they're distressed? Were there people who would perhaps have died had you not been able to be there?
Very well possible. That's very possible. We got some guys, three guys that was in a car that was right there next to this creek. And they was probably 300 yards from where the pipe ruptured. And the blunt of the product went that way. Now, when the rescuers got to them, they was in the car, they were passed out, they were unresponsive, they broke the windows out, got them out of the car, and took them to one of the command centers there where we had the road. There they started coming back to. If they would have stayed there very much longer, it is possible that they could have perished.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, that works. That's much better now. I think you're back on.
Okay.
So what would you do differently? I mean, this was probably a surprise. It sounded like you responded as well as possibly could be expected, but what would you say to emergency responders in terms of the best preparation for a situation like this?
The main thing, if y'all are not having any kind of pipeline awareness or safety meetings, that's the first thing they need to do is get with these companies. I think it's Paragram is the name of the company that does ours. Every year we'll meet with the pipeline people around in our area, and we'll go over scenarios, do tabletop discussions. Now, the company that happened to operate this pipeline was not doing that at this time. Since the incident, they are.
What about equipment?
You're going to need a lot of air packs, a lot of air, especially if you're in a rural area. You know, me being a first responder in my age, I'm 56 and I am a little overweight, so I can suck an air bottle down in no time if I'm doing strenuous activities.
Mm-hmm.
So what we did was our city fire department is about 25 miles from here, the Yazoo City Department. They actually have a system where they can fill bottles, and we had somebody taking bottles back and forth to them, getting them refilled so our first responders could have air to work under. We did have one deputy and some more, even though we were stressing over the radio, do not go in without an air pack. They went in, and you could tell that he was getting in a bind by his voice talking over the radio. So we actually sent deputies in to get him first responders with air packs. And a lot of the CO2 stuff, in my opinion, is kind of played down on, well, it's not really that dangerous. It is dangerous on a large release like that. It's just like, I don't remember what the doctor's name was a while ago, but it's like he said, once CO2 hits water, it forms carbonic acid. And I know in the oil wells and stuff, if you don't have the right kind of pipe in the well, it'll eat it up. It'll destroy it. And that's because of the carbonic acid. It's got moisture to it. So you know your lungs are moist on the inside, your mouth's moist on the inside, your eyes. So I can see and say where if you're in that situation long enough that it could damage your internal organ. And it's just like you said earlier, if you're deprived of oxygen long enough at the right amount, you're gonna pass away.
So as Yazoo County, as your department invested in new equipment, different equipment, anything new to? Do you have a budget for that?
We have. Well, we've been getting a few grants and stuff, and we try to get extra equipment through these grants and all. Yazoo County is the biggest county in the state of Mississippi, and they say it's the poorest county in the state of Mississippi. We have a lot of farming country and timber industry. Unlike a lot of the smaller counties have automotive plants and everything else to generate revenue off of. We're not that big with the revenue. So, and it's we have a lot. In our county, we have 8 volunteer fire departments, and we all assist each other. All we got to do is say, hey, sometimes we don't even have to call for assistance. They on the way to help. So we all work together good. That's going to be another important thing with your volunteer fire departments. They're going to have to work together well and train together.
Okay. Well, I'm wondering, it's about 8 o'clock. Maybe we should go to the Q&A section. We've got a number of folks who've already inserted their questions into the chat. We've got 3 questions in the Q&A. Let me see if I can bring in.
Well, okay, bring me in before we go. Jared, hang on, because some of these questions are going to be for you. I wanted to do a quick. Here's what we want people to do as we move forward piece before we go in the Q&A. So if you're an emergency service or healthcare provider, we are hoping that you are going to begin to prepare a local response plan and recognize that you're probably going to need mutual aid. Think about the training and the equipment that you're going to need. Air supply respirators, we just heard, are a must. Be sure to coordinate those plans with your local units of government. Navigator or any other pipeline developer who's coming to Illinois or any other state that has folks represented on this call should be required to pay for that training equipment. Somebody like Yazoo County shouldn't have to pay for it. The pipeline developers should pay for it. We didn't ask for the CO2 pipelines to come here. They're not bringing any economic development that could otherwise offset those costs. If you're an elected official and you've got zoning, what we're hoping you'll do is adopt a 1-year moratorium on CO2 pipelines, and that will give you time to prepare regulations that help establish the route of the CO2 pipeline. It'll help you coordinate with emergency service providers to provide those local response plans while the PHMSA rulemaking is in process. And Illinois has broad home rule powers that allow this to happen. We're working with Bold Alliance, and their attorney has prepared model ordinances and we can share those with you. If it takes more than 12 months, it takes more than 12 months, right? This is a big thing, and it might. Moratoriums can be extended for another period of time. And if you don't have zoning, we have a model resolution that can be adopted as well. And it says a whole host of things that I won't go into now, but essentially what it does do is it would ask the Illinois Commerce Commission to withhold granting a certificate of authority until certain things have been done. We want to know about dispersion modeling and identifying risks in your jurisdiction. We want to make sure that all the training will be provided that needs to be provided, and that the equipment will be paid for by the pipeline developer, and so on. And again, we have a model ordinance that does those things. Zoning has the teeth, however, and that can maximize public health and safety in your community. A resolution is the next best thing, but that's a statement of what you'd like to see, and it's not binding. Now, if you're a resident, and I suspect many of you on this call are, we're asking you to urge your local officials to adopt a moratorium and then proceed with the zoning regulations. And if they don't have zoning, then ask them to adopt the resolution I've just discussed. And you can write them, you can call them, you can go to public meetings and use the public comment portion of their meetings to make your ask. Make it public, make it loud, and share what you've learned tonight with your friends, colleagues, neighbors, and family. So now I think we have a website we'll introduce later, and you'll get a lot of information from there. And I do want to say that you'll get a recording tonight, along with links to some of the resources that I just mentioned in a follow-up email. So now, Lan, begin us in the Q&A.
Okay, I'm going to start out with one from Edgar Rodriguez. Says, if the pipeline is underground, would that help control temperature? And would that prevent a massive release? I also fear the small leaks that may not be detectable as an enormous release, but continue to release CO2 over time. Are pipeline control offices able to detect small leakage and pinpoint the location of the release? That's like 3 questions, but who would like to take that, or part of it?
Oh, I can.
Okay.
I don't think you're going to see a small leak on the CO2, especially if it's at the supercritical phase at 1,400 something pounds of pressure. It'll be catastrophic. If it starts out small, it's not going to stay small. It's going to cut that pipe just like it was sawed. And as far as it being underground, the picture that y'all had a while ago, I think Richard had it, of the incident there at Satoshi. It blowed a hole in the ground. It was probably 60 foot deep. It was where they had bored under a road bed, and it blew that whole bank out. They actually had to take a skid steer loader and go down. It covered 433 was the road that it went under. It covered it in 6 inches of dirt and mud. That is what everybody saw that they thought was green, was that dirt impregnated in there with that CO2. That's why everybody thought it was a green cloud. It was white, but it has so much dust and dirt commingled in with it that it looked green.
Okay.
So no, I mean, the soil over it won't stop it. The main thing to do is, if you hear a hissing sound around that pipeline, is back up, get as far back as you can, find that pipeline marker, call that company and tell them, look, y'all have a serious problem fixing to happen.
Okay. There's a similar question from Laura Snyder. Would the rate of spread, in other words, the blast zone, be similar between a CO2 pipeline versus HVL pipeline rupture?
I might be able to take that one because I'm an expert in all those fields, but
Yeah.
I've investigated too many failures in the last 20 plus years. The blast forces are going to be different. HVL The blast is associated with ignition and explosion, it's combustion. While the CO2, it's the forces of the release out of the pipeline and the phase change that, goes from the inventory in the pipeline trying to become a gas. And you saw in the DNV video, it can change with time. It can really increase. So a first responder is going in there trying to save somebody. He may get caught in an overpressure when the CO2 that's formed within the pipeline somewhere, upstream or downstream breaks free. And so you got to be real careful, not overly cautious, but very cognizant of what can happen here. And so it's a different animal. And so while HVL lines, hazardous volatile liquid pipelines, are a special class of liquid pipeline, they can cool when they leak, even on a rupture. It's a different phenomenon. It's an entirely different phenomenon. Okay. The problem with CO2 is it really can release a lot of material, and it takes a while to completely vent.
And it's violent. When it releases, it's violent.
Oh yeah, it's violent. Bingo. You've been there.
Another thing about the CO2 too that you'll see is weather conditions will have a lot to do with the way that cloud travels. Yep. If it's overcast or if it's raining, it's going to stick to the ground. Yep. If it's at night, it's going to want to hug the ground. I've seen a release at night where 1 minute you'd have a plume going straight up in the air, real nice, pretty plume. 50 minutes later, coming at you. So that's something you have to is your weather conditions.
You are so right, Durrett, and we really appreciate your expertise here with us today. Mary has kind of a follow-up question that kind of goes along with this. Won't there be systems in place, Rick, so that the pipeline company can shut down their flow of CO2 very quickly when there's a rupture? Tell us about those systems.
No, and the pipeline regulators are trying to get around to deal with this. They're getting a lot of pushback from industry. How quickly can you determine a rupture, and how quickly can you close the valves? Even if you close the valves right away, the pipeline will vent. That inventory between the many miles of pipeline valves will continually try to release with violent force, and it'll change with time. It can change with time, and especially the larger diameter pipelines, they can really put a lot of tonnage into the air, and anybody caught in that can get into real trouble. So I don't say this to scare people. You just got to be aware of it, because we don't want anybody getting killed. And it's to credit to the first responders. They're the heroes in this event. It's not us guys. It's those people who are on the front lines having to deal with this. And so you want to give them the equipment, the tools, the training, and more importantly, that communication that the companies finally figured out they got to do, because even though these ruptures are rare events, when they happen, they can be very bad, and they can do a lot of damage. And that's the thing that the industry likes to say, well, these are rare events. Yeah, but if you're caught in the event, you're a victim.
Thank you. Lan, you want to take the next question?
Well, here's an interesting one from Joyce. It says a navigator engineer at one of the January public sessions in Illinois said they were currently planning shutoff valves every 30 miles. Any comment on that? I mean, 30 miles of pipeline, the volume.
There's no rule that says what it has to be. All right.
Yeah.
The PHMSA may work on that. Okay. But you saw, 12 miles or so in Mississippi, and it's a function of diameter. It's how much tonnage is between the valves. And then that tonnage is going to want to go to gas, forming dry ice in between that can block the pipelines and then break free. And so it's all a function of tonnage and inventory in the pipeline. And so closing the valves immediately isn't going to stop the tonnage of release. You need to want to do that, but anybody within those zones is going to be impacted. And so you have to be careful. 30 miles, again, what's the diameter of the pipeline? Are they going to really be doing it in liquid phase, or are they going to be doing supercritical? You calculate the tonnage, and you can just say, well, if there's 1,000 tons between the two 30-mile valves, well, that isn't going to help you any. So, and there is no easy answer here. So, navigator saying 30 miles. Well, what are you? Is that on your 6-inch line or on your 24-inch? Come on.
So thank you for that. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and go to Ted on this one. We have a couple that I think are related. And one relates to sequestration. They probably both relate to sequestration. And Edgar Rodriguez is saying, we know fracking is known to cause earthquakes, but how do they maintain temperature in the final locations? So the possibility of increased pressure on site and I don't understand it. So the final location so that the possibility of increased pressure on site and raise the possibility of a massive release. I guess what we're looking at is we know when you're injecting CO2 into the ground as a part of the oil and gas industry, that can trigger earthquakes. How does that relate to what we're looking at here?
Well, first of all, I'm not a seismologist, but I have looked into this a bit, and it's clear that if carbon dioxide is going to be pumped underground to sequester it, that first of all, the site has to be well selected, because some areas are much more earthquake prone than others. You don't want to start doing this in an area that has known earthquake faults. And some states are much more susceptible to that than others. Then there has to be an analysis of how fast you can pressurize the sequestration zone. So you pump some CO2 into it, you get up to a particular pressure, and this all has to be monitored. And then you allow it to dissipate, the pressure to dissipate away from the injection zone for a prescribed amount of time until it's ready to receive some more. But this all requires a lot of monitoring, and there's a fair amount of experience in enhanced oil recovery. But that experience has to be transposed into this, and then be applied in a way that's expresses the lessons learned.
Thanks. And this is a kind of a follow-up question on the same topic, I think, of sequestration. Could a CO2 leak remain in an aquifer for some time before it's detected?
Yes, CO2, if CO2 starts to get into a drinking water aquifer, it'll begin to acidify it. And if that drinking water aquifer is not being monitored, it could just continue to leak into it. And as I mentioned, toxic metals and radionuclides could then leach out of the rock and get into the drinking water. So the quality of the drinking water and its physicochemical characteristics have to be monitored if we're really going to try to pick up CO2 in an aquifer earlier rather than later.
Thank you,
And
Ted.
here in Mississippi, on the injection wells where they are injecting CO2 into these formations, they regulate how much injection pressure you have. The company does periodic downhole pressure tests to see what the bottom hole pressure test is in the formation. So they have to do all this, and the state actually requires this to make sure that they are not overpressure in that formation.
Okay, next question, Liam. Thank you, Durd.
Okay. Another one from Edgar. Are the pipelines offsetting the cost of additional equipment that you may have had to purchase because of the pipeline experience? In other words, is the pipeline company helping the county fund any emergency equipment?
They have done some things to help us out. one of the big topics that come up was emergency alert system. In case this ever happens again, they did give the county some money. We have what they call a rave system. Our county director, emergency management director, has this thing downloaded on his computer, and he can send out text messages, he can send out emails, and it's another one too that he can send out. I forget what it is now, but they have helped us purchase that system. I think they actually purchased it for us. But the people in the community have to get on this system. It has been in our newspapers several times, our local papers, telling everybody what they have to do to get on this system. And it's just a text message to let you know. We use it a lot when we get a lot of bad weather. We also use it for that too, to let people know, hey, a tornado has been spotted in this area. So something like that was very helpful. And they are kind of getting on board, trying to help us out with some stuff.
I think we have a few more questions we can go through. I'm going to go kind of in order if I can. And here's one that should be easy to answer for those of you who are pipeline experts. I'm going to you, Rick, here. Okay, we learned in Satartia that the pipeline shifted because of heavy rains in the area. We've all read that, right? This sounds like it could happen most anywhere, right? How common is it for a pipeline carrying hazardous material to shift in a way that might cause or contribute to a leak or rupture?
I've investigated way too many girth well type heat affected zone ruptures lately on main pipelines. It's not unusual. The safety regulations say the operators are responsible for accounting for that, what we call abnormal loading. There's been some rather spectacular ruptures as a result. If you were to really study the PHMSA report on Sartasha, they'll tell you the X80, while they talk about complying with API 1104 recommended practice standards, I don't expect prudent pipeline operators to just comply with minimum recommended practices regarding pipeline installations. I expect them to exceed it, especially on exotic pipe grades like X80. And so if you were to study the PHMSA report way back in the appendix, you'll see certain information's not been given in that report that indicates, well, great, you had a good welding procedure, but did you have a heat treating procedure to complicate that, to follow up with that? And so it's not unusual for girth well failures. It's just as not unusual to have regular ruptures on the full pipelines. Both of these are, as I say on my slides, are high rate releases that can vent with tremendous forces for quite some time. It's happening way too often, and the industry knows some of this. But when they start talking about their pipes being invincible, they start believing their own myths. And as an operator, they get themselves set up for this. This was a very preventable event. Even with the massive rains in Mississippi and the landslide, you know, their duty was to monitor right away and take adequate precautions, and they didn't do that. Hell, they didn't even bring the first responders into the loop. So, you know, I'm being pretty critical about the pipeline operator because they deserve to be criticized. Shame on them.
And I'm going to do the follow-up question from Joyce Herent to Durwood because, and sorry, man, I jumped in. You get the next one because it's related.
No,
so Durwood, what do you worry about next with the next breach, if there is a breach? What do you worry about next after having gone through this?
I just worry about the timing of it. If this would have happened in the middle of the night and nobody would have been coming down the road and run up in it, how long would it have taken somebody to let us know what was going on? You know, if you're in the house, you're in your bed asleep with the CO2, if you don't hear this eruption and this loud blowing sound, you'd liable to just keep on sleeping and not never wake up. So timing is one thing that's very critical and important. And demographics. Here, a lot of this pipeline is coming through a real hilly area. I'm not a geologist, but I do study a lot of rocks and fossils and stuff. And we have a terrible thing in Mississippi called Yazoo clay. With all the rain that we had, and we was actually in a flooded situation out in the Delta. It was flooded. So you have all this water sitting out in the Delta up next to this ridge line. We had a lot of excessive rain, the clay swelling and everything, the ground moved, and what happened. So let us pray it never happened. Operators are trying to keep this from happening again. They, up in the area it happened, they just went in there and they have drilled a bunch of about 10 holes 800 foot deep, and they are putting monitors down in this hole to monitor ground movement. They also have 8 surface pinpoints on the surface that they will actually go there once a month, monitor it, see if there's any movement. And on the pipeline itself, they are attaching some monitors to catch that pipe. If it starts moving, then they know, hey, we got to go here, we got to dig and let this thing relieve itself. But, you know, as far as the question, the demographics of where it's at, luckily in that area is kind of rural, but I can tell you it's a spot where this pipeline actually goes through a well-populated area, and the pipeline's it's not 200 yards from a hospital. So, you know, I hope it never happens there. That is that type of soil there in that area is really in real good shape, but I think it should be some kind of standards implemented to where how close to a hospital or a well-populated area these lines are put.
We really agree with you. Lana, I'm going to take one more question and then you wrap up the questions and then we'll stop talking.
Okay.
Well, I think Kathy's comment and question is relevant. If you want to go there, all right, let me just read it and then there's a few more to go through. Kathy says her house is less than 1,000 feet from the pipeline. It'll probably be 24 inches. Sounds like if we don't freeze to death immediately, we'll suffocate with almost no hope of survival. Is that correct? Ted, I'm throwing that to you.
1,000 feet, is that what she said?
Yes, she's 1,000 feet, less than.
So Rick described how these clouds can go miles. There's some modeling exercises say hundreds of meters, but it all depends on those variables: pipeline diameter, the what's in it, the distance between valves, but then wind direction, topography matter a lot as well. So 1,000 feet is close, and it's a danger zone under certain conditions, depending, of course, on the size of the pipeline and all the other variables that we've talked about. Rick can probably add more to that, but
I'm not here to terrify anybody. There are no rules on the distance. So I can tell you the federal regulators are looking at a combination, now whether they finish, a combination of modeling distance as well as a defined parameter that people will understand. It says, based on certain other factors, not only do you get the model, but you're also, whatever one is more conservative, you pick this number. Now that's what they're talking about. You know, the regulators, the federal regulators get this stuff. Getting it into regulation, well, that's a lot harder problem. But what we've got is people wanting to do tax incentives to do CO2 pipelines before the regulations are in effect. And that's a bad combination.
And I know PHMSA is working on that. I had a meeting with a couple of people from PHMSA here. Oh, it's been about 3 weeks ago, and we went out to the site where this happened at and everything. And that was one thing they were talking about, the size of the event, and that there are really no good governing regulations out there for the CO2 pipelines. And that's kind of what they're working at. They're looking, trying to get ideas to see what's happened and what we need to do.
And that seems to be one of the primary messages we have tonight, that the regulations are not sufficient at this point. I think we're going to wrap it up now. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Especially thank our guests, Rick Kuprowitz, Ted Shetler, and Durwood Pettis. Learned a lot, and apologize for the technical difficulties. It's something we sometimes have to live with Zoom and our connections. But I think we had a marvelous discussion, lots of good information. And so tonight we are asking emergency responders, health officials, and the general public and everyone to share this webinar with others. This is recorded. We will put this together and send this out. All who have registered, please share it with everyone you know. If you're an emergency service or healthcare provider, we invite you to begin thinking about what you might need to do to prepare for pipeline emergency: collaboration, planning, coordination, training, equipment, how to alert residents. There's a lot that needs to be done here. And so if you're a county or municipality that has zoning, we're asking you to think about adopting a moratorium on the pipeline and give you time to prepare, to talk about local regulations. If your county doesn't have zoning or doesn't want to adopt zoning, we're asking you to think about a resolution that highlights your concerns and getting that out to decision makers. And if you're a concerned resident or a farmer, we're asking you to urge your local officials to adopt moratoriums, zoning regulations, do whatever we can to protect the health and safety. So our coalition stands ready to adopt or ready to work with local jurisdictions, agency responders, and other health and safety officials. And so this webinar has been recorded, as I said. It'll be available on our website also at www.noillinoisco2pipelines.org. And please feel to contact us anytime.
There's a question about slides. We'll be asking the presenters about sharing slides, and if they say that's okay with them, we'll put those in the
public. Go for it.
Okay.
It's fine with me. I'll send them to you.
Oh, that would be just great, Ted. So we'll do that. And there is one question here that didn't get asked about permanent effects. Were there any permanent effects, Durwood, after the CO2 plume passed? People were evacuated, hospitalized. You had all that horrific CO2 freezing stuff.
Really?
Yeah. So what about last week?
Oh, I have heard of a couple of people which they wasn't in real good shape anyway. Two of the people was fighting cancer, and I think they are having some breathing issues, which I can understand why. I did hear somebody say that they was having trouble kind of a little loss of memory. But as far as anything fatal, nobody has passed away or anything because of it. But there is some lingering issues.
Some lingering health impacts is what I hear you saying, and I'd read that too. So, so that's not good. So thank you, Kate, for that question. And with that, as Lance said, I'm going to pull up our slide here at the end so you know and can write down how to contact us. And we will be in touch with you via email with information promised during this presentation. And we hope to see you next time. And we thank you, everybody, for being here. Truly.
Stay safe.
Thank you all. Good evening.
Good working with you.
Y'all have a good night.